I'm going to introduce to you Jay Feldman. He's going to be giving us an update on policies and practices for a sustainable future with an emphasis on pesticides. Jay is a founder and executive director of the National Environmental and Public Health Membership Group called Beyond Pesticides. Jay has a 40-year history of working with communities nationwide on toxics and organic policies and practices, addressing agricultural, lawn, and landscape management practices that maintain ecological balance and enhance biodiversity and eliminate toxic chemical use. Jay has successfully fought to remove from the market hazardous pesticides and helped draft pivotal local, state, and federal organic farming law, including the Agricultural Productivity Act, which established sustainable agriculture programs at USDA, and the Organic Foods Production Act, which created the USDA Organic Certified Food Label. In 2010, he was appointed by the Obama administration to a 5-year appointment on the National Organic Standards Board, a stakeholder board that advises on organic and determines allowable materials. And there he served as chair of the Crops Committee. He's a recipient of the Rodale Institute's Organic Pioneer Award in 2021. And Jay has a master's in urban and regional planning with a focus on healthy policy from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. And he has a BA from Grinnell College. So, wow, great bio there. Jay, thank you for joining us again this year, and I'm going to hand it to you for this update.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to speak on the policy issues. We're all watching Congress carefully these days to see where things will be going. Slide one, please. Beyond Pesticides was founded in 1981 to identify both the hazards and alternatives to petrochemical pesticides and fertilizers. We bridge farmer, farm worker, public health, and environmental interests. We track the science, maintain databases on adverse health effects from the independent peer-reviewed scientific literature, and advance organic alternatives. We work in communities, assisting municipalities with the transition to organic land management in parks, playing fields, and schools. Next. Rachel Carson is really an inspiration to the organization. The quotes that really pull me into her book and to her thinking is that chemical controls are self-defeating, for they have been devised and applied without taking into account complex biological systems. And that'll be a theme throughout this conversation. And she said we must make wider use of alternatives. Next. In discussing some of the critical policy issues regarding the use, adverse effects, regulations, and underlying legislation, and the adoption of alternatives that are most protective of health and ecosystems, we need to provide some important context. So we're going to start out just mentioning the three basic laws that become thematic to the policy conversation here. The first is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, which establishes the registration of pesticides, and then the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which establishes the residues or tolerances that are allowed in our food, and then the Food Quality Protection Act, which really amended both these statutes and updated them in, wow, it's a long time now, 1996. FIFRA is more of a risk-benefit statute. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, controls the tolerances, as I said, based on a health-based standard that utilizes risk assessment. There are certainly other laws that intersect with pesticides, as you all know, laws governing waterways, drinking water, clean air, toxic substances, and toxic waste. However, it's clear that in the scientific literature and the reviews, by the US General Accounting Office, by the US Inspector General, the EPA Inspector General, and the EPA itself, that there are serious limitations in all these laws that are reflected in this list here of issues that come up as somewhat deficient areas of research, areas of oversight. So the conversation begins with what is widely recognized as a law in FIFRA, especially, that does not evaluate fully the mechanisms that cause harm, like chemical mixtures and synergistic effects, and does not evaluate alternatives that may be less harmful or for which there are fewer uncertainties. One of the most problematic limitations is EPA's failure under FIFRA to implement the provisions in the Food Quality Protection Act that requires the testing of pesticides for endocrine system effects. You know, endocrine disruptors adversely affect organ function and are associated with numerous adverse effects, including numerous types of cancer. Endocrine disruptors defy classical dose makes the poison toxicology, with effects at minute doses at critical windows of vulnerability during development. Next slide. Unfortunately, we are not seeing improvements to correct these deficiencies. EPA is continuing to look at evaluating endocrine disruption, but nothing is definite at this point. There are numerous examples, including weakening restrictions. The weed killer used for genetically engineered crop, dicamba, is an example of a chemical that's being continued despite clear adverse effects. And some of you may have heard about EPA recently registering literally 4 new PFAS pesticides. And just the other day is now talking about, or very recently talking about, increasing that to a 5th. We are in an age of deregulation, the elimination of programs, the cancellation of grants. Under the fiscal year 2026 EPA budget, there is a funding change, quote, funding change to eliminate the pesticide program implementation grants program and the pesticide compliance monitoring and enforcement cooperative agreement program, as well as a pollution prevention categorical program. It's really important to know this as we think about what can be done at the state level. Next slide, please. One more bit of important context, the courts. There are 2 foundational laws and rights that are under attack currently. These laws form the basis of our right to seek redress, the right to know and ensure transparency about harm, and the local decision-making process in our towns, our counties, and cities. These are issues that have been upheld by the Supreme Court. And here are the 2 key decisions of the Supreme Court: Bates versus Dow AgroSciences, in which the court said Congress surely would have expressed its intention more clearly if it had meant to deprive injured parties of a long available form of compensation. The industry maintains that its compliance with EPA pesticide registration process under FIFRA we discussed earlier should serve to prohibit people from suing them. And then the court also said in the second sentence there, providing an incentive to manufacturers to use the utmost care in distributing inherently dangerous items. That's what access to the courts provide. The second decision, landmark decision, Wisconsin versus Mortier, really establishes the rights of local communities, the towns, cities, and counties I mentioned, to adopt standards that are more stringent than federal law. The court said FIFRA does not preempt local governmental regulations of pesticides. States' historic powers are not superseded by federal law unless that is a clear and manifest purpose of Congress. So let's keep this context in mind as we look at what's happening in Congress regarding these 2 landmark decisions that are absolutely fundamental to the protection of health and the environment. You can imagine that the chemical industry has felt that these interpretations of law are meddlesome and bothersome to their bottom line. They address the upholding of local authority to restrict pesticides in the Mortier case by going to state legislatures and getting the states to actually preempt local authority. They were not able to preempt local authority in the state of Maryland, rah, and 5 other states. And thus we have the Montgomery County ordinance, restricting pesticides on public and private property. And on the question of compensation, you've all heard about the Bayer Monsanto cases in which the company has lost to the tune of billions of dollars in jury verdicts on glyphosate Roundup. And that's revived an effort by the chemical industry to seek immunity from litigation with the argument again that their products are registered by EPA under FIFRA. Monsanto went back to the Supreme Court twice on this, and since an earlier decision in Mortier and in Bates actually, and could not get certiorari, a hearing review of the lower court decision. Next slide. We start with the right of people to sue for companies' failure to warn under 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 law that protects against the failure to disclose harm. It is not always easy for vested interests to change authorizing legislation. So to just go up to Congress with a freestanding bill and say, we want you to adopt a law that protects us from litigation when we cause harm or failure to warn people of harm. Instead, it has become more common practice to attach language into an appropriations bill. So that's what you see on this slide. The leadership of Congress in the House, the US House of Representatives at this point, is trying to use the appropriations process to reverse this long-standing legal protection on what we call failure to warn, that the company did not disclose on the product label that their product could harm or cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and that the plaintiffs allege that the contracted harm from the product's use was not warned. Again, the industry maintains that their product registration from EPA releases them from the responsibility to warn, since EPA does not require a warning about cancer. You will not find a cancer warning on a pesticide product. Actually, EPA doesn't require a warning about any chronic disease on pesticide product labels. The language in the bill, and that's a bill that's 183 pages, buried in the bill as section 453, actually does not require a warning about any chronic disease. The language in the bill is a sweeping prohibition on pesticide product label changes, except under a lengthy and onerous review process that could take up to a decade or more. And then to make matters worse, in that bill is another section that precludes EPA from conducting a risk assessment that it had planned, finalizing that risk assessment, implementing, administering, or enforcing it on sewage sludge for PFAS contamination in the actual sewage sludge. I should note that as Congress is working up here in the federal level through this appropriations bill, they're also visiting state legislatures around the country. They visited 8 state legislatures in the last year and got the state legislatures to adopt preemption clauses, or what we call immunization clauses, immunity clauses from failure warn litigation. The states of North Dakota and Georgia adopted this immunity legislation, and legislation is now pending in 6 states. And we expect to see more. Next slide, please. The other legal principle of local authority would simply take the form of federal preemption of local authority in the upcoming Farm Bill. Next slide. In this context, I'd like to step back for a moment and look at what EPA could do or can do, and in some cases has done, even with the limitations in the law. So I've spelled out what is the norm, okay? In August of 2024, with the regulation of the weed killer dactyl, EPA exercised its imminent hazard authority, which is a provision in FIFRA. And under that authority, it cited 4 findings and actually banned dactyl immediately. It cited adverse health effects, irreversible lifelong impacts to children, particularly farm worker children. It found that there were no practical mitigation measures, meaning no matter what they did to change the product label, no matter what restrictions they put on this, they couldn't adequately control it to protect kids. They also found that there was a prohibition of the continued use of existing stocks. So they made a finding that this thing was so dangerous that they had to stop continued use immediately. And then the finding I really want to talk about here is the finding that there are alternatives. Next slide. So what we do essentially is we follow the independent peer-reviewed literature, scientific literature, through this pesticide-induced diseases database. We bring that through all our public comments to the federal government, but we also bring it to the states and localities when we talk to them about adopting more restrictive standards. And the Dacthal situation, we call it the Dacthal standard, is really a good example of where you can sort of intervene and say, look, there are adverse effects, the mitigation measures aren't adequately protective, people are being exposed to it today, and we must stop this use. So there are 2,700 studies in this database. Next slide. So, as we talk about alternatives, we're talking about soil. Soil is a part of the Dacthal decision. Next slide, please. But in our view, we must be talking about working with nature. We can't have this conversation about restricting pesticides without talking about the solution and the management systems that must be adopted to prevent the need for the pesticides. So to meet this challenge, working with nature and ecosystem services is critical. Nature's our friend, right? The more we invest in nature, the more nature will give back to us. We know this from working with pollinators and the value that they bring to productivity of our fruits and vegetables and flowers, excuse me. Next slide, please. The, the important thing here is that we're not talking about a product substitution approach. We're talking about an analysis of practices so we can get off the pesticide treadmill. And the good news is that we do have a system in place in federal law. We don't have to invent this thing. We don't have to create a committee. We don't have to build a new definition for a new type of agriculture. We have a definition of organic in federal law that now supports a $70 billion industry. This has happened in my lifetime, in your lifetime, most of your lifetimes. And we must build on it. It's a law that allows for continuous improvement, and that's a great opportunity. It created at USDA the board that Greg mentioned I was on for 5 years, the National Organic Standards Board, which is very unique. It's not just an advisory board. It maintains control over the allowed substances, under the national list of allowed and prohibited substances. Very unique. But behind the organic label is an inspection, certification, and enforcement program, and a structure for public participation in what those systems shall be and what those allowed materials shall be. Organic is the only label that offers this level of restriction and enforcement. Next slide. So the national list is really critical because it is a review process. It's open to public comment and oversight, and it's controlled by this board that I mentioned. We take that standard and this list that's called the list of exempt pesticides under 25B of that FIFRA statute I mentioned. And we bring this as a standard that has been incorporated now into numerous local statutes, local ordinances. We're hoping someday in federal law that governs public and private property. And these standards, next slide, become part of an organic system that really meets community expectations. It meets productivity goals. It meets profitability goals. And we know this because Rodale Institute has conducted a 40+ year now longitudinal study in which they find higher productivity and higher profitability in organic systems. That's the first paragraph there. The second paragraph is part of the scientific literature, and there is a lot that shows competitive yields and that are equivalent with and higher than existing what we call conventional or chemical intensive agriculture in corn and soybean yields with improved water quality. Next slide. I do want to say that some of the high-tech solutions to this, which we're hearing about in terms of agriculture that reduce quote unquote pesticides, have very devastating impacts still in minute quantities and don't necessarily build soil health and soil life, which is incredibly important to cycling nutrients, breaking down organic matter and solubilizing nutrients for uptake by plants. And this is what we're bringing to local communities. This is a a soccer field, it's a softball field, and it's a field hockey organic field, beautiful, more stress resistant, less water intensive, and over time returning value in terms of the cycling of nutrients and nitrogen, especially. Next slide. So we're taking this to communities under our Parks for Sustainable Future program. You can Google Parks for Sustainable Future, in which we're supporting communities throughout the country, working with park superintendents, school superintendents, and open space managers. Next slide. And in addition to the actual practices that are going on, this is an incredibly great opportunity for educating the community. This is a sign that we put up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which really explains what's going on in the field. And education like this has incredible effect on people when they think about what they're buying and the land management practices associated with the agriculture that supports the food that they eat. It has impact on farm workers because they begin thinking about who's producing our food and what exposure is it having to farm workers and farmers. Impact on the ecology and the ecosystems in which the food is grown, concern about waterways, and the fact that we live in an environment that is not protected by borders, that chemicals move across the country, that they end up in fog and rainwater, and that we share water supplies. So as we begin to think more holistically about the results of our decisions, we begin understanding that it starts with the playing field in our town, or the school district and what is being used to manage the fields in that school, or our backyard. And we explain that this is a soil-based system. We're talking about understanding what's going on in the microbiota in the soil, and then we can begin to connect that to the microbiome in our bodies. Next slide. So we're talking about moving away from a risk assessment based system, which is what is FIFRA, to a precautionary approach. And organic is a precautionary approach because it's starting with the notion that we need to look at what we need in the system to meet our expectations in terms of aesthetics, in terms of profit, in terms of productivity. Next slide, please. So we end up at organic. That when we started in the fields, listening to farm worker stories about their poisoning, and then listening to organic farmers about their solution, we knew back in the 1970s that we had to chart this path to find an alternative that was not just a policy perception, but that included a label with integrity and a review process and accountability to the stakeholders. And that's what organic is. It's a system that eliminates the bad actors right from the get-go. It embraces the notion that we are part of the ecosystem. Without the ecosystem that we depend on, life itself will not exist. And I'm excited to move this forward in the context of all the work that you all are doing to identify the hazards, with this as the real solution for our future. Next slide. I'm available anytime at this contact at Beyond Pesticides, and look forward to working with you guys further. Thanks for all the work that you all do.
Fantastic, Jay, and thank you for the work that you do. The advocacy role of Beyond Pesticides is really important. So thanks for all that great work. All right, well, we have a couple minutes here, and if we can just maybe hit a question or two, I'm going to pull one from the Q&A here. So you told us just a couple minutes ago that the productivity, the yield, and the profitability of organic farms can be comparable or even better. Um, but what's new? What is there anything new in agriculture that will capture attention and really help, as the attendee asks here, help producers to begin to switch over to organic?
Well, new things come up all the time, right? Like if you had asked me that question a few years ago, I'd have said that colony collapse disorder among the bee population is new. And it's really exciting in that it's a horrible problem, but it's exciting in that it's attracting a lot of public attention. And that attention then becomes conversation in the community about what can we do to protect bees and biodiversity. PFAS is an example of that. PFAS has, even though we've had a lot of other legacy chemicals, the USGS just came out with a report you may have seen that shows that the tracking of 22 chemicals, pesticides, over 30 years that they've been tracking is still turning up DBCP. DBCP is still coming up in our waterways. DDT, DDE, the breakdown product. So we've had legacy chemicals before, but PFAS has really attracted people's attention. And I think these sort of spikes in awareness around the hazard, same thing happened with Monsanto and these jury verdicts of billions of dollars, is bringing attention. And if people can use that to leverage what the real solution is, and we believe that's organic, I think it's helping us to propel this whole thing forward.
Hmm. Okay. Great. How about financial incentives? Have we ever paid farmers to farm
You know,
organic the way?
Greg, I love you for this question, man. Because the social and environmental value of organic, look at what's been on the backs of organic farmers. They've taken themselves out of subsidies, they've taken themselves out of the conventional agricultural system, and they've invested in the land and the stewardship of the land without getting a penny in return. Although it's become a niche market where they are getting higher prices now in certain markets. So we do have a cost share program in the organic law that helps farmers make that transition. It's underfunded. Um, I believe, there are a lot of other things that need to change. Just one quick example. I was visiting one of our board members, a farmer, and he took me around the farm and I said to him, what are those little hang tags on these trees? He said, well, that defines the buffer zone where we cannot grow organically because our neighbors drifting pesticides onto our land. So they not only have to pay for the transition mostly, they have to take land out of production, which is a cost to them as small. So once we recognize all these externalities that cost us, there's a big debate now going on sewage sludge, which I'm hoping we can get more engaged with as a pesticide community because PFAS is showing up in sewage sludge and there are 400 contaminants that actually have been documented in sewage sludge. So I think when we recognize that farming and farmers are contributing to the social good, that they are giving us a future, that we will invest more in mandating that some of the funding that we give to so many areas of social good in our society, that we include this agriculture as one of those mandates.